All right, Willa, are you ready?
Give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to get my screen sharing here in 2 seconds.
All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to our first in a series of 3 speakers. This is sponsored by the ASFS, and it is funded by the Mellon Foundation, a grant from the Mellon Foundation. And so today I'd love to, or I have the honor of introducing my colleague, Dr. Willa Zhen, who is a professor of liberal arts and applied food studies at the Culinary Institute of America, where she teaches a range of classes from introduction to food studies, anthropology of food, and introduction to gastronomy. We have an incredibly high amount of teaching at our school. We teach a 4-4-4, so she certainly gets a lot of practice putting into practice what she is about to discuss. And she's also author of the book Food Studies, a Hands-On Guide. So Willa, thank you so much, and I will turn it over to you. We'll be talking, or she'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A, or time for Q&A at the end. So thank you. And again, this is being recorded.
Okay, well, first of all, a hearty thank you to Beth Forrest, to Dr. Beth Forrest, for being one of the co-hosts today, and one of the hosts, and one of the people who have made today happen. So good morning, good afternoon, or good whatever time it is for you today. Thank you for coming here today for my talk, Teaching with Sincerity, a Humanizing Pedagogy for Teaching Race. And before I begin, I just want to take a few moments to acknowledge some people that need to be acknowledged and some organizations and institutions that need to be acknowledged. So first and foremost, I would love to thank the Mellon Foundation for funding the series and for making this possible. I'd like to thank the Association for the Study of Food and Society and the Culinary Institute of America as co-hosts. I would love to give acknowledgement to the ASFS board, especially Dr. Farah Turnikar, and to the organizers of today's event, which include Dr. Beth Forrest here in our presence today and Paulina Liu. So thank you to you all for making this possible today. So presenting today as part of the Food, Race, and the Humanities Racial Justice Pedagogy Speaker Series means a tremendous amount to me. And anybody who's been around me this weekend knows I've been thinking and thinking and thinking about what I'm going to say and share with you today. And of course, I hope, I can offer some wisdom and insights. It is a tremendous professional honor to be here today, to be seen for my work, and to have this platform here to share with you, to your colleagues and friends today. It's also incredibly important to me as a woman of color, as a woman of color scholar functioning in this professional space in the field of food studies, that I'm here today. And I wanted to give a moment to think about that a little bit. Let me move with my slides here. Oh, this is working. Okay. So first and foremost, I like to have us collectively think about the times you've seen someone who looks sort of like me, a woman of color who's of East Asian heritage in a position platform of privilege, speaking and addressing a crowd of colleagues, of other scholars and professionals working in food studies. And let's just give that a second here. And I have to think about this too, and I thought about this as I was writing this talk. So I start off with this. I am starting with this because I want us to contextualize my presence and also of the next two speakers of our dear colleagues, Dr. Patricia Clark and Dr. Meredith Abarca, who will be next up in the lineup, of why I think this means especially a lot to me. I can't speak for them, of course, but I think why our presence as speakers is perhaps a little bit unique and necessary. So these figures are here for US-based faculty. If you're in another country joining us, thank you for making the time difference and being here. But also, if you're in a different country, these figures are perhaps a little bit different for where you are at. But just to give it some context as to why this is especially, this event, this opportunity is especially important and meaningful to me as a East Asian scholar of color. US Census figures from February 2023 calculate that approximately 2.1% of all American adults have PhDs. So if you are a PhD holder, we are very rare, we are a very rare sort of species amongst the greater populace. I don't think this is unknown to us, but I think for us who live, primarily in academic circles, sometimes we forget a little bit that our norm is not always the norm. So amongst American adults, that's about 1.9% of female adults. So we're just a little bit shy of 2%. And in a 2021 survey, of which you see some of the statistics here from the National Center for Education Statistics, among full-time faculty in the US, as taken from fall 2021, 73% of American faculty were white, with a balance of about 35% white female and 38% white male. 12% of faculty were Asian, about 5% of which are Asian females and 7% Asian males. 6% of faculty are Black, specifically 4% Black female and 3% Black male. 6% of all faculty were Hispanic, split about 50-50, 3 and 3% between male and female. About 1% identify as two or more races, less than half of 1% identified as American Indian or Native Alaskan, Alaskan Native, and less than 1% of 1%, half of 1%, identified as Pacific Islander. So white males and Asian males also comprised of the higher percentages of tenure track faculty than non-tenure track. Asian American faculty are also more likely to be working at the junior level. And this is also true across other races, ethnicities. So Asian Americans, of which I identify myself as, at large are often stereotyped by the model minority myth, and Asian American women in particular are expected to be non-confrontational, uncritical, and submissive. Asian American faculty, of course, are also subjected to these biases that exist in larger society. Studies show that faculty of color regularly receive lower ratings, and for Asian American faculty, that bias shows up in many ways, including the fact that our last names may mark us as foreign or suggest that we are foreign and lead to lower ratings. Some common flags in faculty evaluations of Asian Americans involve biases about accents, questions of whether we understand American cultural norms, and even questions of whether we are even American, a questioning of if we even belong in this society and not just in academic spaces. So I'm sharing this information because it leads me to the first point I'd like to make today. Before we consider strategies and ways of operating in the classroom, I want to hold space for what I and what we as educators bring into the classroom and professional spaces. So first and foremost, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that teaching race is hard, regardless of one's background. For faculty of color, it may mean a whole other layer of complexities and issues to grapple with on your own, in addition to helping guide students through these concepts. So I think it's important next to acknowledge that being a member of a highly racialized group can add layers of complexity to the job that someone who is less racialized, to which I mean someone who is either white, identifies as white, or can pass as white, doesn't necessarily have to grapple with. These are important things because part of what I'll be engaging with is this idea of teaching the whole person, but also bringing us as educators, our whole persons, to the classroom. This is part of what I will be detailing in a moment as part of a strategy of the praxis of teaching with sincerity. So all educators, regardless of racial, ethnic, and cultural background, must wrangle with how to approach the subjects they teach. I don't think that's a surprise to those of us who spent time in the classroom. Paulo Freire, arguably one of the most important scholars of the 20th century of critical pedagogy, provides a description of education that is helpful for thinking about how education is often framed. He points out that education is often constructed as what he calls banking model. This banking model presupposes that students are the collectors of knowledge to be held in a bank, like the one you see in front of you. Over this time, this knowledge is supposed to grow and accumulate value just like a bank account, assuming inflation hasn't reared its ugly head and your money isn't quite worth what it was. He and other scholars of critical pedagogy have pointed out that the banking model doesn't work for many subjects. Any subject that involves lived and embodied experiences, experiences that can't be banked, don't necessarily work under this framework. This is not to say that the banking model isn't important for certain subjects. For instance, consider some of the subjects in your elementary school education or things that you learn when you're very young. One must simply memorize the letters of the alphabet, despite what our current Common Core educational system might suggest. Multiplication tables need to be drilled in. There's just no way around it. There's not really another strategy for acquiring some of these basic skills. Freire argues that instead of banking knowledge, particularly when we get to secondary and tertiary education, as we are all in the business of, he poses that the goal of education is to activate voice, agency, and community, using what he calls humanizing pedagogies as praxis are ways of cultivating these aspects of learning and education. So building on Freire's and other critical pedagogy scholars' ideas, what I propose here is this notion of sincerity as a humanizing pedagogy, as a way for teaching race, as a way for students and learners to see themselves as part of a bigger world. Sincerity is a necessary element within the praxis of a humanizing pedagogy. What I mean by sincerity is the part of the definition that often gets lost and muddled, one that doesn't quite come through clearly when you go through dictionary.com or Merriam-Webster or Oxford English Dictionary. Sincerity is often defined as an honesty of mind or a state of freedom from hypocrisy. What I'm suggesting here is that sincerity goes beyond that. It's thinking about the end goal, your intentions. What's important to recognize is that sincerity is not just honesty or a state of freedom from hypocrisy. Being sincere and the acts of sincerity are transgressive and radical. This is not to say that people purposely go in to be insecure in a situation, but teaching with sincerity means stopping and checking yourself as an instructor and a facilitator of conversations and of critical thinking and education. What are you prioritizing is what you should think about. Are you trying to bank and collect knowledge in a vault or aspire for your students to do that? Are you thinking about the whole person and thinking about what are your goals today? So what I encourage and what I'm proposing is that we should frame our teaching as what do we hope to achieve and what are the actions that we hope to enact amongst our students? What do we hope to activate within our students as members of the classroom and as of members of society? And what do you hope they'll carry with them as they progress through life? It also means when teaching with sincerity, this idea of thinking about how do I get my students, my learners to see other people as people? Once again, this seems sort of like a trite throwaway comment. How do I get others to see others as people? Teaching with sincerity means to do that, to get students and learners to see one another as people. It means helping humanize big systemic and structural issues in ways that allow students to feel comfortable in engaging with these topics. It means helping them move into places and spaces where they can engage more thoughtfully, they can reflect, analyze, and potentially even become critical of the systems and structures we operate in. Therefore, as the title of my talk suggests, teaching with sincerity is not just about teaching with good intentions. It's thinking about how to turn intentions into actions, how to help students think and rethink who they are as whole people, and how they relate to broader systems and structures. Thinking of pedagogy is not just a series of good intentions to bank, but as ways to activate and encourage students not to just engage with material, but with deeper notions of self, others, and society. So like scholar, activist, and teacher, bell hooks, I think, write and teach from a very personal place. Some may argue that this is self-indulgent, that navel-gazing is a vanity project. In Hooks's Teaching to Transgress, which was published in 1994 originally and has since, remained in print, Hooks points out that scholars from the margins are often taught to be obedient to existing systems and structures of power, knowledge, and hierarchy. Like Hooks and other scholars from the margins, I was taught not to muddy the waters by meshing the personal and professional. As an anthropologist, you need to keep some sort of distance, as sort of was the classical thought of how to do anthropology and be an anthropologist. Younger me often bought this wholesale. And of course, why wouldn't I have? The people who insisted on these ideas of distance, of separation, of separating personal and professional were generally older, more senior, whiter, and possessed chromosomes that I did not. They had attained the professional success and climbed the academic ladder in ways that I had hoped to. In thinking through my educational career, I can name the number of times I had someone who looked like me and as an instructor. And I grew up and did the entirety of my schooling and later undergraduate work in California, where there are people who indeed do look like me. And in California, we have some of the oldest cities and settlements of Chinese Americans, including in the city where I grew up. So finding someone who looked like me was not uncommon per se, but it was certainly underrepresented in academic circles starting from elementary school on the way up. So in elementary school, I happened to have the privilege of a first grade teacher of Cantonese heritage, which was a godsend to all the other Cantonese speaking immigrant parents who clamored to put their kids into her class. It was the only teacher they felt comfortable and confident enough to communicate with. And I had 4 Chinese professors in college, something I had to think about as I was writing this and thinking about my talk today. 2 of whom were in the US, and the other 2 I had while studying abroad in China. So this speaks to, right, the points that I made earlier, that my presence today and the presence of others like me is an absolute disruption to the norm. The presence of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, non-binary folks, non-cisgendered, queer, working class immigrant, so-called others are also disruptions to the norm. For us to get through school, college, and graduate school meant learning to be obedient to authority, to fit through the systems and structures that we were supposed to fill, right? We were not supposed to take up space, and we could have been reprimanded or ostracized when we do, and still can. So, my presence already being a disruption, and the presence of others like me, people from the margins, being a disruption, um, what I do then is already viewed with skepticism, right? But this position here, knowing that you're operating from the margins and the fringes, allows for liberation and freedom because people like me aren't usually here in these types of seats in the first place. And for those of you who perhaps fill more conventional seats, right, this is also a useful place to sit and think through your teaching and education too, is that how do then we maybe facilitate and create bigger spaces and more room for people to fill up academic seats and environments, and also how do we create space to allow for more transformative and transgressive pedagogy amongst all. So Hooks points out that one of the most transgressive and disruptive things one can do as an educator is to make things exciting. And this is a strategy that can be taken on by anybody. But in particular, if you're someone who already is operating from the fringes away from the centers and the norms, your ability to do so, you're perhaps already met with some skepticism, so why not take advantage of it and let the classroom be an exciting place? Hooks notes that excitement in higher education was viewed historically as problematically disruptive of the atmosphere of seriousness assumed to be essential in the learning process. And my teaching over the years has made attempts, better or worse, to be fun. Fun, excitement, joy, and loving, as Paulo Freire calls it, are liberatory for teachers and learners. As Hooks has pointed out, fun can coexist with serious and intellectual engagement. And in my book, Food Studies, A Hands-On Guide, that was my humble attempt to formalize what I've been doing in my classrooms all along, to let us have some fun when we're thinking about food and engaging with food. Food is sensual, food is material, and it should be allowed to be fun at times. And of course, though, this fun is not just a one-person effort. Excitement, fun, and joy has to be generated through collective effort. It's not just a passive thing to be received. So wanting students to have fun and creating spaces for fun to find joy in education is a sincere intention, something that I will be going over in a few moments on how we can create those spaces. But this seems contradictory to teaching race, because teaching race is not supposed to be fun in any way, right? Talking about race is not supposed to be fun, right? It seems almost disrespectful to use the word fun alongside such a heavy, loaded, problematic concept like race. There are genuine consequences and repercussions for teaching race and racial concepts nowadays, and also historically in the past, if you happen to be living in and if you happen to be schooled in spaces and states where talking about race has been banned, and ideas, dealing with and engaging with ideas of race are perhaps dangerous in different ways. For those who were schooled and educated in such environments, we can sometimes overlook and forget that simply using the word race can be a tremendous transgression of social norms and cultural ideals. For those students that we teach, and it's important to remember this, simply being in a space that allows for such talk is transgressive. It is important for students to wrap their tongues and mouths around the word to allow it to be spoken aloud out of their mouths. It's important to recognize and acknowledge where students are starting, that simply saying that word, race, is a tough place to start. We cannot push students to engage with these concepts, much less critically engage with these concepts if they haven't been allowed to say the word and name the ideas, questions, and norms around them. In teaching race, we must teach the whole person and their lived experiences. So the trick is then to create activities and ways of engagement that don't seem risky, that appear fun, but allow one to sit with the serious. So first and foremost, I start with this idea of sincerity as a way to bring in the fun, to allow students to say the word race, to engage with the concepts, and to later then dive with the systemic and structural issues that follow. So I use first this idea of sincerity and vulnerability, and various scholars of learning and epistemology, including them Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jean Dewey, Paulo Freire, and others, have pointed out that what is problematic or challenging about learning is that there's fear. That fear arises in learning and among learners constantly. And all learning involves dealing with the new, unfamiliar, different, and strange. Rousseau in particular points out that the absence of experience as a kid leads to fears in adults. Many of these students who've never even uttered the word race or have been forbidden from talking about and engaging with these words have never been asked to challenge them because they have not been allowed to. So to experience learning and to experience learning about race is to experience, right, the world around and to give yourself the possibility of being wrong. So sincere teaching means creating spaces for students to engage with their ideas of race in the first place, to later then challenge them, and to welcome the possibilities of being wrong without fear. In teaching with sincerity, I like to outline several different strategies. And I think of it as a process of breaking down, right, and tackling this tough word. I identify this as a process of forgot a slide here, of teaching students first to see and learning to look, learning to listen, and learning to inquire. So in learning to see and learning to look, I start here because students often don't know how to do this. For me, I am an anthropologist by training, as Dr. Forrest mentioned, and most days I'm mostly anthropology adjacent. And while I'm formally trained as a social anthropologist, I haven't really been part of an anthropology department in over a decade, but I still try to bring in the ways I see the world, and anthropologists generally see the world as something, as a useful tool for helping facilitate the work I do in my classrooms and beyond. What I do is to get my students to see a bit like an anthropologist too, to take in what's around you and to see what's on the surface, and then to sit with that and allow oneself to sink below the surface line to see what's underneath. So one of my first priorities in teaching race is getting students to see and then leading them on the journey of learning to look. This term that I use, learning to see and then learning to look, I'm influenced in this concept by critic, writer, and artist John Berger, whose work and subsequent BBC series Ways of Seeing was published and released in 1972. Berger's work was influenced by Walter Benjamin, particularly Benjamin's work, The Work of Art and Age of Mechanical Reproduction, published in 1935, which considers how art involves seeing and then looking. Um, Berger points out that seeing is something that our species and others do as a necessity of biological function, and seeing, quote, comes before words and can never quite be covered by them, is not a question of mechanically reacting to stimuli. We only see what we look at. To look at is a choice. So what I do in my classrooms and what I propose as a strategy for teaching with sincerity is teaching people how to look and how to look sincerely. One activity I've done with my students over the years is getting students to look for and to see first and foremost, and to look at the fact that racialized ideas and race is all around us. Getting students to see and then look can be an uncomfortable and then a process and then actually lead to some self-actualizations. In teaching them to look, I encourage them to consider, how are you seeing race and racialized ideas show up in your everyday life? Race is not, as I teach and remind them, the big overt headline making stuff. Identifying hate groups like the KKK, neo-Nazis, hate speech, symbols of hate are, very obvious ways of thinking about race. And those things hopefully show up less than more often. We have been taught to see those things as bad things. To borrow from Peggy McIntosh's piece, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, we are taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not invisible systems conferring dominance on my group. So seeing hate speech and hate symbols and hate signs, seeing a hate group around, those are acts of meanness that are highly visible. But what is important is teaching students to look to see how there's invisible systems underneath the surface. One activity that I have my students in my Anthropology of Food course complete is to look for how race and ethnicity show up in food products, to look for how race and ethnicity show up in invisible systems and in everyday ways. On the surface, this activity seems fun, right? And the idea here is to create these fun spaces, fun activities, which can be liberating if hopefully done right, and to help students see that, talking about race isn't necessarily just this big, heavy idea, but it's here as part of our lived embodied experience. So I have my students shop either virtually or in person at a grocery store of their choice. They have to consider the following things when they do so. What is this item? What does it look like? Who is this product for? Is it for an in-group member or an out-group, meaning someone of that same affiliation, of someone of the same racial or ethnic group, or someone outside of that? How do you know this? Students are asked to then consider images, symbols, colors, descriptors. Thinking also too, where is this item placed? Is it in the mainstream aisle
Sorry,
alongside?
Willa. Sorry, I think you're hitting your microphone because we're
Sorry.
getting a lot of sort of feedbacky stuff, and I think what you're saying is super important. So I want to make sure we catch
Sure.
that.
Thank you. Sorry, let me move back for a second. So when I have this assignment, I have students think through a variety of prompts and concepts, including thinking about, what does this item look like? Where is it located? Who is it for? Thinking, where is this item placed in a supermarket, for instance? Is it amongst the mainstream items, or is it in an ethnic or international aisle? How is it priced? In particular, how is it priced compared to other items? So the students start looking, whether online or in person. And they start looking and thinking, they start seeing things, they start seeing products and items, and then they start looking and looking and re-looking and thinking about, okay, these items that I walk by in a supermarket or click by on the screen may have more to tell and may have more to say about race and ethnicity than I first thought. For instance, this is one of my students' analysis of Cholula brand hot sauce. This is a very popular brand of hot sauce here in the US. It identifies itself as imported from Mexico as a Mexican brand. Um, and on the surface, it may appear to be such. But as my student pointed out, the text description on the bottle states Cholula Original Hot Sauce is crafted from a generations old family recipe that features arbol and piquin peppers and a blend of regional spices to deliver authentic Mexican flavor and heat. Taste the best life has to offer with Cholula Original Hot Sauce. With medium heat, the options are endless for this versatile sauce. Try on everything from eggs and rice and beans to beverages and even pizza with an exclamation point. We love it in both traditional Mexican enchiladas and tamales, as well as new favorites like burrito bowls and fish tacos. From our distinctive wooden cap to the original recipe hot sauce inside, every bottle of Cholula is a celebration of great food flavor and our Mexican roots. The student then, after, paraphrasing, And quoting what Chaluda presents itself in terms of its marketing, the student then reflects this is a clear description of the, quote, exotic marketing that is used in order to sell products to primarily white consumers. They emphasize how authentic and spicy the flavors are while simultaneously explaining that it can be used on traditional Mexican dishes like rice and beans, but it can also be used on pizza. It brings a sense of familiarity to foods that would otherwise be too ethnic, quote unquote, for their white consumers. So this act here of taking something that seems on the surface fun and sort of trivial, right? A shopping trip to the supermarket, a shopping trip browsing your favorite grocery online, is used as a way to break down some of the barriers of thinking about race. That first students are just taught to look. There's not a lot of stress in that. You're just asked to see and then to look. And then what results is that students are given a space to think more critically and analyze and reflect and think about race and ethnicity in everyday systems around them, right, including in everyday objects of consumption. Now that, I've worked this idea of students are looking, right, next comes this act of listening. And listening, learning to listen in particular, is the second necessary act of teaching with sincerity. Because before we can dialogue and have critical conversations and critical engagement, we must first learn to listen and sit with ideas. And the act of listening can be incredibly uncomfortable because we are so unused to silence nowadays. I'd like to remind everyone that Gen Z, the generational group that comprises much of our current undergraduate population, and even some of our graduate population, um, they are what some demographers and so sort of sociologists call a multi-screen age group or a five-screen culture. What this means is that someone is likely to have multiple screen technologies on hand and be constantly engaging with them. These technologies can include a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop, but things like gaming consoles and more. The thing is that young people are indeed listening. Podcast listenership is actually very high amongst the Gen Z population. There's all sorts of studies from SiriusXM, which is a streaming on-demand streaming service, Edison Research, Pew Research. These different studies conducted all show that Gen Z listens to podcasts, and some statistics and figures suggest that even over half of the population that do. But they often listen to it for entertainment. Listening to learn is a whole different set of skills. And in another course I teach, which is called Research Methods for Applied Food Studies, that course has worked closely with the local museum and cultural space, the Rear Center for Immigrant Culture and History, which is located in Kingston, New York. Rear is a fascinating institution because it's located at the site of a historic Jewish bakery, which closed in the late 80s, early 90s. It was a family-owned and operated bakery run by Eastern European immigrants, the Rear family. And it operated throughout much of the 20th century, serving as a community hub and cultural hub, and a space that welcomed different groups, particularly working class immigrant groups from different parts of Europe, and also was a space for working class African Americans who lived in this community. So as a cultural hub and community space, it today, of course, no longer operates as a bakery, but serves as a museum. They have, tried to sort of maintain and keep intact the parts of the bakery that still exist as a way of telling the family story. But they also do and have put on exhibits that speak about, engage with ideas of immigration, race, and belonging in the 21st century. So in this course, we have worked with the Rear Center on a variety of projects, and most recently worked on an exhibit called Taking Root: Immigrant Stories of the Hudson Valley. This exhibit was open in 2023. This exhibit is built around oral histories from 36 different individuals from 22 countries and 6 continents, and it was a pandemic era project focused on collecting oral histories from the period of 2019 and to 2022. My classes worked alongside then Executive Director Dr. Sarah Litvin and Curator Dr. Sarah Gordon in conceiving different ways of telling immigrant and migrant stories. But to do that, first we had to listen. As part of this project, my students and I had to listen to a number of oral histories and stories to code them for data and to identify themes to be extracted for the exhibit. One theme that appeared in nearly every participant's oral history was the subject of food, and my students worked to develop placemats explaining, contextualizing the food and food ways of a selected group of participants. And it was challenging for my students to just listen with full attention. Their screens had to be off when we we're doing this. There was no video to look at. They had to learn to tune their ears and attentions to really listen, to hear the voices, to hear what they sounded like, to learn about the clues through the tone and tenor of the voices, about emotions, experiences, to hear the joys and sadnesses that could be inferred through the sounds of the speaker's voices. The students had to think about what it meant to listen through accents and to be patient with the voices of people for whom English was a second, third, fourth, maybe fifth language. These are stumbling blocks that often keep people from listening and truly hearing something. So what listening did, giving space to having students simply hear voices and listen to sounds and listen to stories, help personalize the seemingly abstract and personal stories of immigrants, migration are made real when we hear the voices. So to round out my second suggestion for how to teach with sincerity, what I suggest is giving your students spaces to listen and to hear. This can happen in the classroom, but can also mean engaging with community members and listening to their stories. When we turn off the noise, the other screens, and focus on the voices, we hear things we otherwise don't hear. Listening itself is a radical act when we're used to having noise and when we're not used to hearing the chorus of voices that exist in our society. And listening itself can be fun. We are taken on journeys with our narrators. And one of the most sort of impactful oral histories my students and I listened to was one from what was then a 13-year-old boy who's now, closer to college than he is to middle school. But this was a young boy who immigrated to the United States from Senegambia, and he spoke about the things that little kids speak about that make them happy, about playing games, playing sports with his friends, and also discovering things like salad, which was a strange thing for a kid coming from a culture where green salads were not commonly eaten. And we're taking on this journey with, the narrator and learning to hear the world from his perspective. This is something that, once again, is a sort of fun act, but also a very transformative act of being able to just give space to hear someone's voice. The last thing I propose is learning to inquire. And Hooks points out that it's imperative for professors and teachers to create spaces, not always necessarily safe, but spaces that allow for growth and expression. And she points out that it's necessary for professors to take the first risks in linking confessional narratives to academic discussions so as to show how experience can illuminate and enhance our understanding of academic material. But most professors must practice being vulnerable in our classroom, being wholly present in mind, body, and spirit. Zinn and Rogers calls this inquiring with students into their learning, not just making students inquire, but inquiring with them and into the things that support and hinder, that are relevant, irrelevant into that learning, and listening with genuine curiosity, respect to their experiences as learners in our classes is another form of inquiry. Such dialogue implicates our teaching and makes us vulnerable, but it also creates a space for us to grow with students. Our power can then become power with them rather than power over. So giving students the freedom to inquire about things, but to also inquire with you is critical. Inquiring with students in vulnerable ways allows them to see us as whole people who are also figuring themselves out, and also allows them and gives them permission to see themselves as whole people who are also figuring things out. So what I propose here is that learning to inquire means starting with vulnerability, and teaching with sincerity means being vulnerable. When I teach my classes, I start with myself a lot of times, not once again as navel gazing or sort of being self-indulgent, but it gives my students then permission to dive in their own stories and personal anecdotes. And one of the things I often do is talk about, when teaching race, my own challenges in thinking about race, sharing stories of my family's history and biography, stories of immigration and assimilation, or perhaps lack thereof, as it happens sometimes. Um, Sharing that my ancestry, when I was younger, is simultaneously a source of pride, shame, and embarrassment, as well as joy and happiness. Um, it also, I also bring in engage with stories about my life today, not just of my ancestry and my past, but my life today. In particular, I bring in and share vulnerably my frustrations and fears and anxieties about race as a mother of a young mixed heritage child. As an anthropologist, as a food studies scholar, as someone who's sort of a generally conscientious human, I understand all the intellectual ideas behind race and the concepts and all the sort of systemic and structural issues. I am able to process those on one hand, but I share with my students that I struggle with this on an everyday level because when I am confronted with an official form of some sort where I have to pick a box for my son, and I have to identify his race, I don't know what to pick. I didn't have any problems picking out a name. My husband and I knew a name pretty early on. We knew kind of how to name him, and we had ideas about how to honor his different heritages and different parts of his family that make him him. But I have struggled with, and I continue to struggle with, what boxes to tick. Um, to borrow a sort of Gen Z term, I used to cringe, as the Gen Z folks say, at the term the human race. And I'd sort of roll my eyes, my skin would crawl when I hear someone say things like, "Oh, we're members of the human race." Um, but as a parent, I think about this term, the human race, because in some ways it sort of allows me to skirt around these concepts of the fact that race is real, in the sense that marking a box or marking certain boxes, right, will mean giving him the weight and baggage or perhaps privileges of whatever category that I pick on the box. And it also, makes me think about the sort of stressors of what results by picking certain boxes. What if the categories I pick now become a source of frustration later on? What if they don't match what I want him to see himself as in the future? What if he disavows the categories that I have picked, or what if he disavows the categories that are attributed to me? So I bring this example up, I share this bit of vulnerability, and I do center myself at times, right? Because it shows students that we don't always have the answers, and that to teach sincerely means showing our humanity and recognizing we don't have the answers, and that we too are inquiring alongside them. I too am trying to figure out these ideas of race, that I understand it as a professional, as a scholar, as a thinker, but when it comes time to fill out a box like this, I have anxiety, just as some of them may be too. So I'm walking alongside with them as we go through and unpack and think through these concepts. So when I'm teaching my courses, I think through race often as an anthropologist, but also as a human and as a parent who's got a child for whom I can't figure out what box to tick. And when I teach race, I think about it and I talk about it as a complex mix of race, ethnicity, identity that also involves ideas of kinship and ancestry and legal status and rights and responsibilities and also respectability. And when I teach this, I ask my students a series of prompts to respond to in a journal format in a low stakes way. This is really not something that I put a lot of weight on, it's participation points. And I have this before I get into race, and I ask some questions like, how do you define your race and why? How do you define your ethnicity and why? And for you, is there a difference between the two, and why or why not? And the journal format allows for students to have a private conversation with themselves and with me without having to sort of expose yourself and make yourself vulnerable to the entire class. You're only sort of making yourself vulnerable to yourself and perhaps me. It's a place for exploration. And yet there's still a lot of distress and discomfort when I ask this sort of question. For instance, students sometimes will refuse to respond or sort of write in the most sort of generic ways. Um, or they sort of scratch at the surface because it's uncomfortable to go below. For instance, I had one student write, "I categorize my race as Caucasian since the complexion of my skin is lighter." When we engage with these concepts of race, ethnicity, identity, and I later return to a second round of this prompt, um, I then go over this again after having class assignments and on race and ethnicity, and I start with the fun stuff like having students go hunt out for food products that deal with race and ethnicity before diving into these definitions. And when students are given, the chance to engage after having the fun stuff, and when I'm able to show them things like vulnerability and that I'm walking alongside with them and being vulnerable with them, you get sort of different answers in thinking about race. For instance, from one student, They wrote on the second response, I've been trying to piece together somewhat of a solid definition of the words race and ethnicity. I was not expecting it to be as difficult as it was to do so, considering I thought my definitions of race and ethnicity were pretty solid before talking about in class. And so it simply can't be ignored because if it didn't exist, then there wouldn't be inequality between races, meaning it's completely by social concepts and how other humans beings perceive you. And the student then goes on to think about how their race shows up on them in terms of their name and their physical features, but yet, their personal self-identification doesn't necessarily match because they are, as they describe, biracial, and there's a whole part of their heritage that isn't being honored because the superficial aspects like their name or the obviously physical aspects like their physical features are first noticed instead of the actual stories and the deeper interrogation of their heritage. So in doing this assignment here, right, this with my students, it allows them to sort of learn to interrogate because they've gone through the fun stuff first by learning to see and then to look. They've learned to listen, to hear voices, and to also hear their own. And this last one, this last sort of aspect of teaching with sincerity, of learning to, inquire and to interrogate, is where you get to actual think, get some progress moving on with get some actual progress with teaching race. And so these three concepts here to sort of wrap up quickly aren't sort of a foolproof fix all for teaching race, and they don't necessarily mean that, you know, everything in the world's problems and everybody's understandings of race are sort of fixed through these examples here. Um, these three strategies here that I presented, don't necessarily undo a lifetime of cues, ideas, stereotypes, and biases. But what I am suggesting to you all today, and what I am challenging you to do, is to try sharing parts of yourself and being vulnerable. Allow your humanity to show through when you're teaching, and to do that with sincerity. It is okay to walk alongside with your students and to share that you too perhaps are uncomfortable with race, or how you're conceiving of race, or how you're grappling with this. Um, this sort of last aspect of teaching, of inquiring, is certainly less fun than looking and listening, particularly doing things like going through the supermarket and thinking through where race and ethnicity show up in food products. But the first two aspects allow you to get to the heavier stuff, which is the deep inquiring. And what it does then, it lowers the barriers and allows students to inch towards deeper meaning and towards sincere approaches to thinking about challenging subjects. So to conclude, what I've proposed today are some ideas of how to take good intentions into good actions, and the process of getting learners to see and to look, to listen, and to engage critically are fundamentally important skills. And it's important in this process to recognize ourselves as whole people when we're doing this, to recognize what we're starting from and what we're bringing into the classroom, aspects of our personal identity and personal identification as instructors, who bring in so much more than our professional expertise. It's also giving students space to see themselves as whole people too, operating in the world as members of broader institutions, systems, and structures, and as people with the opportunity to grow and to inquire and to query and critically reflect on the worlds that they live in. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'll pause here for any questions, comments, and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Willa. Really, I of course have a bit of an insight. I know a little bit about what you do, but it's always wonderful to hear it in a more formalized way. So, does anybody have any questions for Dr. Zen, or comments or strategies that they found that have worked well in their class as well? Yes, I do understand some of you have to leave for class or other life obligations. So thank you again for coming. Willa, what do you do when you have a student who's really resistant against um, looking or listening or seeing? how do you handle that?
That is an excellent question, and I think that's something that a lot of us have to grapple with, whether it's about race or any number of sort of more critical and sort of challenging topics. I don't always have a neat and tidy answer for that, and I'm not perfect at my teaching. It's another act of vulnerability. I'm not perfect. I'm always constantly trying to do better. Um, it's getting them to as close as they can get, and that's all you can do. I think being sincere is that. It's getting them as close as you can get and recognizing that, um, sometimes learning is not just a one-way conversation, it's learning with students and they're learning with you. Um, I've been thinking a lot about bell hooks, preparing for this talk, and that's something that bell hooks points out in her teaching to transgress is that, some of the students who had the most sort of denigrating and harsh comments were actually the ones who years later commented and reflected back that actually that was really transformative. So maybe it's not just maybe maybe it takes a little bit longer for the light bulb to go on. Oh, Beth, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Um, there is a comment in the meeting chat. Yes, I think because it's a webinar, um, the mics aren't on. Wondering about your perspective about classroom settings where particularly white students are learning and the ways in which it can be painful or harmful for non-white students. How do you think about balancing space for learning, growing, inquiring with protecting white non-students?
Okay, let
Yes.
me. Thank you. Ah, yes. Okay, so how do we deal with creating learning spaces for diversity of students, and in particular, non-white students? How do we protect and particularly make sure that their learning is protected and also respected? Um, this is a challenging thing. And this is something that, once again, bell hooks addresses a lot of, and other scholars of color who deal with critical pedagogy think about, is that it's a challenging thing of how do you give them space but not put them on the spot? How do you not make someone the token whatever, and make them sort of responsible for a whole race of people and their experiences? Um, it's it's tough. It's trying to engage conversation, and sometimes it means giving students the permission to back out of things if they don't want to engage with it, particularly students from sort of underrepresented groups or sort of groups on the margins, and saying, if you don't want to engage, it's okay. That itself is an act. It doesn't necessarily mean silence or complicity. It just means you don't have to take on the labor of educating people, because it's a heavy thing to ask a student to do. Um, Other things too, um, is that it's seeing where the room is at, right? And I think sometimes we forget that. Um, I think it's sometimes easy to think about how we. Let me think of a way to phrase this. Um, I think it's also setting the expectation that just saying it and articulating that this is a space for growing and learning and inquiring is important. And that's where the vulnerability part comes in, at least for me, is saying that I don't have the answers and I'm going to work through this and I hope you will too. I think just putting that out there for students, particularly for white students and students who sort of are sort of closer to the norm, so to speak, that's important for them to hear, is that you need to do this work with me, and it's not just a certain set of people who need to do the work. I think putting that out there is important. So those are some suggestions I have. Um, I'm looking through the chats here. Someone else has a comment of what methods should and shouldn't be adapted by white instructors. Um, I think something to think about too is that, um, I think it's important to address whiteness. I think that's something that people are trying to skirt around, and certainly certain political positions try to frame whiteness in certain ways. I think it's important to address that. That's part of the vulnerability, is thinking about what does that mean for you as a member of whatever group you are, whether it's being white, someone who is BIPOC, someone who is from, sort of a sort of more norm group, right? Someone who's cisgendered, heterosexual, someone who's queer. What does that mean? And how does that inform what you're doing? Um, I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think that's often important that we kind of skip over that conversation because it's uncomfortable to acknowledge our position and our backgrounds. I do, because that shapes how I see the world. And I think it's important for, to create that space that it's okay to interrogate that and be vulnerable about it. I think someone else had a question in the other. How do you talk about race in class without making racialized students uncomfortable? I think that was covered. How do you generate buy-in around operationalizing a humanizing pedagogy within traditional systems? And how has that gone? And what has worked well for you? Um, so how do I create buy-in, and how do you get people to participate and engage in ways that are meaningful to everyone? It's hard. Getting people to trust you doesn't always work. People don't always trust me. Why should they? Right? I walk in, they're told that I'm their professor and that they should trust me, and that's it, the end. I mean, it's doing, what we have to do as professors anyway, which is getting them to see us as humans and someone that we that can be trusted. When talking about race and and making racialized students feel more comfortable with this, it's letting them speak about their experiences if they want. It's also letting them not speak about their experiences if they don't want. Um, I think that's critical because, as someone mentioned earlier, there's this sort of tendency to make them stand in for someone of the entire race. And it's important to recognize that they don't have to do that if they don't want to, or sometimes students find it liberating to share and to be heard in ways that sometimes they're not. It's reading the room. I don't have a perfect template on how you fix that and find out which way things are going on any day, but that is a strategy. Um, and once again, I really rely on this idea of vulnerability because I think that really helps to open the conversation that we are figuring out too as professors who are supposedly wiser and smarter and better and more educated, that we also grapple with these concepts in our lives. It's tough, it's challenging. And in at least the US, I can't speak for all societies, it's something that we're constantly having to grapple with because it's very much something that we're constantly figuring out as a society, our ideas of race and systems around race.
Well, again, I think our time is just about up. So thank you so much, Dr. Zen, for joining us, for kicking off the speaker series, giving us a lot to already think about and try in our classrooms. And hopefully we can continue the situation or the conversation perhaps even over at the ASFS listserv if folks are interested. So thank you very much. Everybody, thank you for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Take care.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.